Be strong.
Andreas is very focused in his actions. His gaze is serious and unruffled. Here he casts his gaze sharply at the chief of this army. Hosan! Andreas heads sharply towards Hosan, holding his sharp sword firmly in his hand and pointing it straight at him. Bright flashes can be seen all around, dust flying in different directions. Hosan, smirking and still on the defensive, asks Andreas about who he really is. Andreas nonchalantly suggests he try to guess who he is. Hosan is taken aback by such insolence from such a young mage. He swings his leg and kicks Andreas so hard that he flies backwards. Undeterred, Andreas immediately gets to his feet, still holding his sword. Hosan looks at him coldly and says that he feels like he's seen this sword in some book and that it's disappearing in his hands. Ignoring his words, Andreas reflects on the fact that Hosan is stronger than Pyatt and that he could defeat him if he used laziness again, but then there would be unpleasant consequences for him. Hosan loudly tells him that so be it, he will add his sword to one of his collections. His eyes are filled with anger, his mouth grinning, mimicking a smile. Andreas nonchalantly answers him, asking what collections are we talking about because he's just a hypocritical thief. Hosan is even more outraged by these words. Hosan furrows his eyebrows and grits his teeth while telling Andreas that he's a bastard. His trusty sidekick, the skeleton Nickel, appears next to Andreas. He stands with his jaw clenched. Andreas stands holding a hovering cube in his palm. From the other side of him, an embittered tiger named Timur appears. Hosan can't believe his eyes. He sees that Andreas is relying on the power of objects. He is angry very much. He looks at his army and his half-dead acolytes who side with Andreas, who decides to take him by numerical advantage. Grinning even harder, Hosan tells Andreas that he is indeed an interesting little boy. The surviving Akalans, Timur, Nickel, and Andreas head straight for Hosan. The one says he never thought he'd meet a sword-wielding necromancer. Hosan pulls his weapon with a golden hilt from his belt. While Hosan's hand is touching the hilt, the sword is possessed by golden mana. Hosan pronounces that he has a select demonic sword, Gynos, in his hand. Andreas stares at the sword wide-eyed in amazement. He sees such a sword with his own eyes for the first time, but he knows of its power. Despite this, it's heading straight for him. Next to him are Nickel and Timur on opposite sides. Andreas swings his sword so that sparkling sparks fly in different directions. Enraged, Timur runs with great speed, almost without touching the floor with his paws. He growls menacingly. His eyes are bloodshot. Hosan knows that the undead are an easy target because they're too dumb. At this time, he is attacked from behind by Nickel, who jumps up high and swings his sharp sword. Tiger Timur hits the ground with tremendous force so that glowing sparks blind him. Hosan dodges them, and in a leap of faith, he notes that they're moving pretty good for a bunch of corpses. Andreas holds a floating magic cube in the palm of his hand with a bright light emanating from it and asks Hosan how he can do such a thing. A huge giant with red hair named Rudradal appears in front of them. His appearance is fierce and very dangerous. His teeth are clenched and his eyes are bloodshot. Hosan looks at him fearfully and doesn't understand what he should do next and how to confront such a huge monster. A huge monster appears out of the glowing haze right above Hosan, swinging its giant sword at him. He in turn looks up frightened. His expression changes. There's a sneer on his face now. He becomes even more interested in this turn of events. He grips his sword tightly in his hand, trying to get it from his belt. When his hand comes in contact with his sword begins to emit a magical light. Andreas watches his sword mesmerized and realizes that it is magical. It temporarily absorbs the power of the enemy and transfers it to the wielder. There is a bright flash of light illuminating everything around and blinding those nearby. Hosan is determined. His gaze is filled with hatred and a thirst for victory over the enemy. He holds a huge steel sword in one hand and a magic sword in the other. He crosses them over his head, pointing them at the enemy. Hosan jumps high up to reach his opponent while swinging his swords. A bright pink light emanates from him. He's insane! There is a look of excitement in his gaze that is frightening. His teeth are grinning in a malicious smile. His eyebrows are furrowed and his pupils are constricted. Rudradal grabs Hosan with his huge hands and lifts him up. Millions of light besties emanate from Hosan. Andreas watches frustratedly and realizes that he will steal Rudrudol's enormous power. With a furious clenched fist and clenched teeth, Andreas realizes that things are bad and that Hosan is a tough opponent. Hosan has stolen Rudrudol's power and turned it over to himself. He looks even fiercer and angrier for it. Andreas and the Acolyte army stand and stare at him. Hosan wryly asks Andreas about the fact that it was one of the giant tribe members. He chuckles gloatingly and thanks Andreas for giving him his power. Hosan looks intimidating and vile. The army of Acolans pounce on him with loud cheers, but Hosan, now having great strength, easily chops them to pieces. The body parts of the masked young men fly off in different directions. Hosan mercilessly kicks the head of one of the Akolan boys. As he does so, he coldly thanks Andreas for using these guys, since he only brought them along because they are his client's subordinates. He's wanted to kill them for a long time. Andreas grits his teeth angrily. He realizes that if he hits Timur and Nickel, things will get very bad. Hosan looks at Andreas with an undisguised smile and sums it up. He says that since there are no more pissing idiots, we can move on to the fun part. Then out of nowhere, the skeleton Nickel appears. He tries to attack Hosan with his sword. Moving behind Nickel's back, Hosan jumps up holding his sword in his hand and says he's about to get in on the most entertaining part. Hosan pulls out his sword, which takes on a bright red color from his touch. Hosan looks at Nickel with excitement, holding a sword in his left hand, and says it's been a long time since he's gotten his hands on a sword breaker. He asks Nickel to humor him. Andreas desperately realizes that Hosan is changing swords too fast. He loudly advises Nickel to stop Hosan from hitting him. There is a fierce fight between Hosan and Nickel. Andreas rushes to Nickel's side to help. Timur watches from the sidelines. Once again, there is a bright flash of light, illuminating the entire space around. Andreas rushes to Nickel's aid, approaching Hosan from the back, and hits him directly with the purple sword, while Hosan tries to straighten out Nickel with the purple sword. That's when the enraged tiger Timur appears. He swings at his enemy with his huge paws. Only bright red glowing eyes are visible on his muzzle. Hosan glares angrily at his opponents. He can see they have a great tandem working well together. The fierce impact illuminates everything in its path. A multitude of splinters explode, the dust from the impact filling everything around them. Timur the tiger is furious to the extreme. His mouth is clenched and long fangs are visible. Andreas looks disheveled and angry. His teeth are clenched, his eyebrows furrowed. The skeleton Nickel's mouth is just as violently clenched. Bright red lights can be seen in its eye sockets. Hosan smiles widely and giggles at his opponents. It amuses him to see how tense they are. Not far from them, Hosan stands with his legs spread wide and still holding his swords. He says he's sorry. Andreas looks at him perplexed, not sure what he means. Andreas looks thoughtfully at Hosan and realizes he was close. Standing next to Andreas is Nickel. Andreas realizes that if Timur wasn't here with them, either Yeno or Nickel would have been cut in half immediately. Andreas looks at Nickel in horror and sees that his left arm is gone and his sword is broken. Nickel, at this time, feeling no pain, stands and stares fiercely at Hosan. Hosan smiles and says it's time to be done with them. He turns to Nickel and says that fighting against him, an undead with an aura, was fun. Andreas desperately contemplates using laziness again. An electronic scoreboard appears in front of him. He shouts to Nickel to back off. Nickel stands there like a panic and doesn't leave. Andreas continues to stare at the electronic scoreboard, not understanding why Nickel doesn't do what he tells him to do. The electronic board in front of Anorius's face does not disappear. He looks angrily at Nickel and repeats to leave immediately. Hosan laughs gloatingly as he looks at them. He says that Nickel has more courage than his master. He asks Nickel about his unwillingness to turn his back on the enemy. On the electronic scoreboard in front of Andreas, it is written that the legendary Phantom of Laziness wants to take advantage of laziness. Nickel stands in a daze. His eye sockets continue to burn brightly. Everything around him is enveloped in tongues of flame. It is written on the electronic scoreboard that the legendary Phantom of Sloth and Sloth will share a cooldown. Andreas is encouraged to use this action. Andreas looks at the scoreboard in surprise. He remembers that Nickel can apply laziness too. At that very second, Nickel is enveloped in a pink negativity. Everything around him glows with a soft pink light. Light beams and flashes fly everywhere. Andreas remembers lying on the floor after applying the laziness and realizes that given the pain he felt that time, as if his whole body was being torn apart, it's better this way, since Nickel feels no pain. At this time, Hosan continues to stand with his legs wide open. He tells Andreas that he seems to have run out of cards up his sleeve. He gloats at him. He says he wants to end this immediately, but he shifts his gaze to Nickel and doesn't understand what's happening to him. There's a look of consternation and bewilderment on his face. Nickel is heading straight for Hosan with insane speed. In his hand, above his head, he holds a sword. Without wasting a second, Hosan is just as eager to meet him, asking him what he's up to this time. Andreas jumps up high and swings at Hosan while telling him not to dare interfere with Nickel. Andreas and Hosan are in a fierce battle. There are flashes from the strikes of their swords. They are both determined. Hosan strikes Andreas with his sword, and the latter deftly defends himself against it, setting his sword up. Hosan is impressed by the magician's sword skills. For every strike from Hosan with his sword, Andreas sits down defensively. His facial expression is focused, trying to anticipate what his opponent will do each time. Hosan says that Andreas's sword work is too sloppy. Holding a red sword in his left hand, Hosan points it at Andreas and shouts, "See you later!" loudly to him. At that moment, the tiger Timur joins in and hits the ground between them with his powerful fist in such a way that Hosan flies off. An angry Hosan looks at Timur and says that this cat annoys him. He decides that he will deal with him first. But then something happens that surprises him greatly. He looks away and cannot believe what he has seen. He watches mesmerized as Nickel, who is illuminated by the bright blue light of his aura, heads towards him. Magic circles can be seen all around him. Nickel continues to hold his sword above his head. The expression on Nickel's face became even more intimidating. His eye sockets burned even more intensely. He opens his jaw wide with rage. He looks at Nickel perplexed and doesn't realize what's wrong with him. He knows perfectly well that his aura is too gigantic for the undead. Nickel is heading towards him. One hand is missing, and in the other he holds his sharp sword. The cloak behind him is fluttering. A bewildered Hosan looks at him and is amazed that he has only made one strike after gathering so much aura. Andreas watches with excitement at what's happening. He is proud of Nickel. Hosan looks at Nickel in horror, his eyebrows wrinkled, his eyes bulging. A multitude of light finest are aimed at Hosan. It's called the secret art of the aura. Andreas covers his face with his hand so he doesn't accidentally get hit. He peers out and watches with one eye still holding his sword in his hand. Suddenly, Andreas sees something in front of him that his eyes widen and he goes into a stupor. He sees before him the master of the sword, the same Nickel before he became a dead man. He stands in the form of a gray-haired old man, just as he once was alive. Andreas stares mesmerized at Nickel without taking his eyes off. He is greatly surprised at what is happening. In an instant, Nickel turns back into a dead man, only now he has gray hair on his head. He sincerely thanks Andreas for what happened and slowly dissolves. Andreas stands beside him with his head down. Hosan stands in the ruins completely exhausted. He bends his head down, looking at his broken swords. The dust makes it hard to see him. Andreas stares at him angrily, wondering how he was able to survive Nickel's secret technique. Hosan looks at his swords and can't believe they're broken, and the swordbreaker and even the farang. At that moment, the embittered tiger Timur pounces on him from above. He is full of rage and mercilessness. Timur hits the ground with his big paw, but misses. Hosan deftly jumps back from the blow. But Timur doesn't give up. He continues to attack him, pouncing from above. An enraged Hosan stares at him with eyes full of hatred, and he's not about to give up. Andreas arrives and they begin a sword fight. They attack each other with their sharp swords without giving each other a chance to strike. Timur grabs Hosan by the pecs and lifts him up. Andreas stands next to him. Hosan looks mad. His mouth is open and streams of scarlet blood are flowing from it. Timur throws him a great distance with all his might. Andreas rushes at him with lightning speed to deliver a crushing blow. Andreas is determined. He wants to finish off Hosan with his sword without using his ego. Hosan is almost completely exhausted, but he has managed to get to his feet. He stares intently at the approaching Andreas. Andreas stands in front of him and assumes an attack posture, holding his sword in front of him with both hands. But Hosan doesn't give up. He chuckles and asks him about finally deciding to join the fight. Hosan's mouth is bleeding more and more. He probably realizes he's finished. He calls Andreas a punk. Hosan stares at Andreas with a sidelong glance, waiting to attack. His eyes are still filled with hatred. Andreas approaches him with lightning speed to deliver a crushing blow. He decides that he will finish him before he can recover. Hosan keeps his eyes on him and waits for the attack. A sly grin on his face and blood still oozing out. Andreas gets as close to him as he can and delivers his long-awaited crushing blow. 3 full moons of different sizes are visible in the dark sky. Someone's voice turns to John Doe and says he's right, but only half right. It slowly begins to lighten. Young Hosan is looking frightened and perplexed somewhere, taking a bite of potato, holding it in her hand. Young Hosan, Deshrun, and the Dark Tiger are sitting at the table eating potatoes. The tiger is listening with interest to what Deshrun is saying. And he says, addressing the lad, that the sword is just a tool and in swordsmanship it should be the last thing he thinks about. Hosan looks at the teacher confusedly and says that he doesn't understand why weapons don't come first, because if 2 equal warriors fight, the one with the better weapon will win. Deshrun puts his hands on his knees and tries to explain to the guy that in a fight between ordinary people, that's why he said he was only half right, and in a fight between aura masters, the one with a deeper understanding of swordsmanship wins. He looks good-naturedly at Hosan and goes on to say that if he doesn't understand swordsmanship well enough, an equal opponent with an ordinary branch could take his life, and that they both have the talent to become aura masters. He holds the potatoes firmly in his hand and concludes by saying that if they rely too much on their instruments, they will ruin their talents. In Hosan's mind, this memory, what Deshrun taught him, arises. He is already spitting the blood that is spurting from his mouth. He imagines Nickel's head holding a sword and realizes that he is an undead, able to use the secret aura technique even with a broken sword. He chuckles and realizes that he should have listened more carefully to the old teacher. He kneels in front of Andreas, completely exhausted. Andreas puts his sword away on his belt because he realizes it's over. Hosan guesses that Andreas is also a disciple of Deshrun and asks him about it. Andreas coldly replies to Hosan that he is. He learned from Deshrun. Bowing his head down, admitting his defeat, Hosan continues to giggle nervously. He says it's not surprising, since he can smell the potato odor from Andreas's sword. The light of a moon's in the sky lightly illuminates the expanse of the forest. At this time, Carlos arrives at the dock with help. An army of cloaked men run after him to help Andreas. Carlos shouts loudly for everyone to climb aboard. They obey him unconditionally and climb into the boat. He nervously tells them to hurry up before it's too late. At that moment, Andreas swims out of the river, trying to swallow as much air as he can. Carlos is surprised to see him and shouts his name loudly. At this time, Andreas swims closer to the boat and tries to climb into it. He is screaming loudly that he thought he was going to die. He desperately tries to climb into the boat and begs to be pulled out of the water as soon as possible. Carlos asks him, perplexed, how did he swim all the way here? Andreas lies and says that they all attacked him at once, so he left his mark on the ground and swam like a madman. Carlos angrily grabs his sword, calling them freaks. Andreas tries to calm his friend down. Andreas calmly places his hand on his bag containing the ill-fated crown and makes sure it is safe. With a nonchalant smile on his face, he says that Muriel is such a place, trying to finally put Carlos at ease. Carlos looks at Andreas with surprise and feels that something is not right here, for among them was a man with a huge aura. He tells Andreas that he has finally figured it out. Andreas looks at him confused, as if he doesn't know what he's talking about. A bunch of people continue to stand around in the boat. Carlos just decides to make a joke to lighten the mood and says that he understands why they call him Algae Head. The 3 moons continue to shine brightly in the sky. A bright light can be seen in a cave in the mountain. The deeper you go into the cave, the more intense the lights become. Andreas carefully sews Nickel's severed arm with not quite so neat stitches. Andreas says enthusiastically that it's ready and asks Nickel to try to move it. He says that it's a sword devil's hand and that it should be pretty good. Nickel tries to make a fist and he's great at it. An electronic scoreboard appears in front of Andreas. Timur and Nickel are sitting motionless. They have built a fire whose light is visible from the street. Andreas looks at the screen in surprise. What it says there strikes him hard. The electronic scoreboard reads that the legendary Phantom Laziness has a 32% chance of evolution. One additional branch is now available to him. Andreas is encouraged to evolve. It goes on to write that the legendary Ghost Fighter has an 88% chance of evolving. He also has one additional branch available to him and is also encouraged to evolve. Andreas speculates that after the fight with Hosan, Timur and Nickel's chances have increased significantly. He decides that promoting Timur would be a great decision and accepts the offer by pressing a button on the screen. At this time, Timur perplexedly looks up, illuminated by a blue magical aura. The electronic scoreboard reads that the legendary Ghost Fighter is undergoing an evolutionary process and that there are 342 hours, 28 minutes, and 3 seconds left until the end of evolution. Nickel and Timur look at each other questioningly. Andreas sits nonchalantly a little farther away from them, musing that he might start working on his elemental magic when he gets back. He decides to study something else. A visitor has appeared in Jester's ominous castle. He addresses him, calling him Morn's apprentice, and asks him about why he has come here. Charon turns to Jester and tells him that he has heard that he is to be removed from the assembly. He looks frightened and lost. Jester looks at him nonchalantly and says that's just the way it is, since he was the one who suggested doing it that way. Jester stands in front of his desk and sternly explains to Heron that they do not tolerate unworthy people in their ranks, especially those who cannot even handle one student. Heron stands confused in front of him. Suddenly he explodes with despair and angrily faces Jester. But he doesn't listen to him shouting and asks him that, even if he didn't take it into account, did he ever do anything useful for the meeting? Jester tells him that he hasn't been able to provide a single worthwhile study or artifact. Charon is completely desperate. He listens intently to what Jester tells him, that even on merit he stands below his apprentice. He asks Heron about whether he realizes how important it is to get one codex. Jester stares at Charon unfazed, waiting for some answer from him, but he is silent. Then Jester calls his name. He asks Heron if he wants to stay in the assembly. Heron is outraged beyond belief. Obviously, that's why he came here. Charon tearfully begs Jester to keep him in the assembly. He says he'll do anything and asks for orders to be given to him. Jester ponders his offer. Jester folds his arms across his chest and tells Heron that they have discovered the location of an ancient magical beast of Kushain near Rodlin. Heron listens to him intently. Heron's eyes suddenly rounded. He becomes very curious. He is amazed that a creature from the age of myths has been found in our time. An ugly beast with 4 paws stands with its head thrown back. It is a beast that lorded over sentient creatures and sucked their power through evil spirits. Several naked people try to escape from it, but all to no avail. A multitude of horrible creatures envelop their bodies. Karen thought he existed only in ancient writings. Jester holds up a hovering stone and tells him that it will tell him where it is, how to free it, and give him the power with which to control it, and after he tames the magical beast, he will have to bring his apprentice to it. Karen recalls the moment when Andreas pulls the bloody sword out of his body. He realizes that Jester doesn't like the fact that he has taken his laziness and does with it as he wishes. He tells Jester that he's fine with that. Karen smiles gloatingly and rejoices in the fact that now he can get rid of Andreas, who put him in this position, and if he's lucky, he can get his hands on a magical beast. Jester orders Heron to pretend this conversation never happened. Heron guesses that it's all about the deal with Salem Ididium. Charon looks calculating and confident. He tells Jester that he can be relied upon and that he, as a teacher, must guide his misguided student to the right path. The next day came. There is a 3-tiered fountain in the park at Rodlin Academy. It is a warm summer day. Andreas doesn't look well. He frowns and thinks about one thing he learned today. He walks tiredly and hunched over in the park, students looking back at him. He muses that he should have done his research in a more convenient place. He has made a good start, but it will take him a while to finish it. He can barely walk. His only dream now is to get to the dormitory and get a good night's rest. Suddenly, someone interrupts his train of thought and calls his name. He lost his temper, wishing now that no one would disturb him. An indignant Lucia stands in front of him and asks him why he doesn't answer her calls. Dumbfounded by this tactlessness, Vivian trails behind her. Andreas tries to squeeze out a smile and apologizes to her, explaining that he was with an acquaintance. He sees Lucia and Vivian walking together and is pleased that they are getting along. Forgetting everything, Lucia pulls out her tablet and turns its screen toward Andreas, asking loudly if he saw the warning posted. Andreas stares intently at the screen, studying what it says. Lucia concludes that they can finally say goodbye to the lame student dormitory. Vivian thinks about the fact that she wants to live under the same roof as Mr. Fairy. The tablet screen says that an unidentified spirit has been sighted in the Tonelico dormitory, and that for the safety of the students, it will be temporarily closed. Tonelico residents are encouraged to check the attached list to see where they will be staying. The high mountains are covered with dense vegetation. There was an incident in which the spirits are attacking the students. This means that there is an event with an ancient magical beast going on right now. Andreas looks thoughtfully at the tablet and marvels that this event happened too soon, for in the game it was 6 months after the start of... Lucia scrutinizes Andreas and asks him why he is so gloomy. She tells him to stop wasting her time and tell her which dormitory he has been assigned to. Not understanding why Lucius is so angry with him, he guiltily replies that he is temporarily assigned to Delagon. Lucia takes on a mysterious look and tells Andreas that he's very lucky, as he'll be able to live next to a beauty like her. Andreas looks at her perplexed and doesn't know what she's even talking about. Andreas sighs deeply and lowers his head. He says that he needs to stop by his place for a bit anyway. He needs to pack his things and check on the dormitory. Lucia smiles good-naturedly, squinting her eyes. Vivian tells Andreas that she will go with him. Andreas agrees and says that she will help him a lot if she goes with him. Vivian smiles timidly at the fact that Andreas let her go with him, and Lucia, for her part, is quite upset. Andreas and Vivian approach the student dormitory where Andreas lives. The building is gray and unassuming. Andreas and Vivian are walking down the hallway of the dormitory. He asks her if she has seen them. She replies that she has seen them in passing, since this is all happening at the magic faculty. She only knows that Professor Heron Diffrin has started an investigation. Andreas recalls the scowling image of his teacher Heron Diffrin. He puts all the puzzles together and finally realizes that his intervention has changed the course of events in a big way. Suddenly, Andreas and Vivian see something in front of them, which makes them stop and freeze, eyes bulging. Dina Allen stands in front of them, leaning her arm against the wall. She doesn't look her best. She looks like she's mesmerized. The only thing she utters is that it's wrong. Saliva flows from her mouth. Andreas runs up to her and touches her shoulder, trying to call her out. Dina backs away from him and tells him not to touch her and not to talk to her at all. Vivian slowly walks closer to them, but tries to keep her distance. Andreas immediately guesses that Dina has been attacked as well. He looks at her confusedly. Dina's gaze is absolutely devastated. Saliva continues to flow from her mouth. Rodlin has 2 middle bosses, including Karen Diffrin. They stand back-to-back against each other. The strange monster Cushane looks incomprehensible. Andrea speculates that only one of the bosses in the game was able to get Cushane. And since the other hasn't made his move yet, so the culprit is... Andreas turns to Dina, who is walking determinedly somewhere, and says that she can't handle it and she'd better leave quietly. Dina looks at Andreas with an incomprehensible look and asks him about what he is carrying. Andreas contemplates telling her his real name. In order to do that, he needs to bring the conversation to that somehow. Without thinking, Andreas says the name Cushane. Dina wrinkles her nose and gives a grimace of disgust when she hears the familiar name. Andreas slaps Dina sharply across the face so that she would sooner come to her senses and come to her senses. Vivian holds Dina tightly to her chest to calm her down and bring her to her senses. Andreas looks at them. Andreas watches carefully to see if Dina comes to her senses. Andreas looks at the wooden wall behind her. Dina slides down the wall and crouches on the floor, holding her head. She begins to grunt in pain. Andreas sits up next to her and asks about whether she has regained her senses. Vivian stands and stares at Dina in silence. Dina continues to hold her head. Without thinking or remembering anything, she asks about where she is. Andreas decides to approach from afar and asks her about whether she knows who he is. Dina looks at him perplexed and asks him excitedly why he is asking her such a stupid question. He tries to calmly explain to her that they were in a dangerous situation and that she was possessed by spirits. Dina looks at him in surprise, remembering nothing. Vivian connects to his words and tells Dina that Andreas saved her. Dina, not understanding anything, replies to Andreas that she vaguely remembers seeing him. Andreas says firmly that they need to get out of the building as soon as possible. The dormitory building remains empty. All the students leave it and move to other dormitories. Dina apologizes to Andreas for the trouble she has caused him. They exit the building. Andreas turns to Dina and asks her about volunteering for the investigation. She replies that she was curious about it because it's not every day you get a chance to investigate spirits, especially since Karen asked her to help him. Andreas juxtaposes all the events and everything makes perfect sense to him. Dina reaches for the magical image in front of her. She looks mesmerized. Karen is standing behind her. It was all a ruse to get Dina possessed by the spirits. From the back, a vile creature approaches her, directed by Heron. She was probably concentrating hard on her magic at that moment and let her guard down, allowing Heron to summon the spirit. Andreas sees that coward Heron is getting bolder. He asks Dina if she knows where Professor Heron has gone. Dina looks at Andreas with a sad look on her face and says that if she's not mistaken, he said he'd go look for the head spirit. Andreas stops and looks up somewhere, and it reaches him that this is where he is sealed. Vivian and Dina walk beside him. A bright light can be seen above the overgrown mountains, illuminating everything around them. Andreas realizes that they must hurry. Charon stands beside a huge statue from which a magical violet light emanates, forming circles, and waves his hands, performing a ritual. At each corner of the base of the statue, on the ground, lie the naked bodies of men. He smiles happily and is happy to see that he did well. From the statue slowly emanates a terrifying beast of enormous size. It has 3 eyes on its face. It has 4 huge paws. Enjoying this sight, Karen's eyebrows furrow, his lips displaying a sinister smile. In his hand, he holds a hovering stone. Now all he has to do is get rid of Andreas Cromwell. Vivian quickly runs after Andreas. She runs along the sandy road. The sky shows a bright pink sunset. As she runs, Andreas turns around and thanks Vivian for going with him. Vivian runs a little behind and replies to him that there is nothing to thank her for and that she is always happy to help him. He runs as hard as he can and thinks that he took her with him because there was no reason to refuse her. At the same time, he is plagued by doubts about whether she will be okay. Not only will he not be able to call on his boys because of her, he's thinking about the fact that there's no way he can screw up and the fact that Vivian is likely to find out about his connection to Karen. Andreas runs without stopping. He feels that he didn't turn her down because he had a lapse of judgment after a sleepless night. He begins to contemplate coming up with an excuse to send her back. They stop abruptly because of something they see in front of them. What is in front of them shocks them. They see other students in front of them. They stand in front of them and make strange noises. They stand there in a complete state of inadequacy and grunting. Andreas guesses that this is the work of Professor Heron because all these students attended his lectures. Vivian looks at them in surprise and asks Andreas about why Professor Heron is doing this. Andreas glares at her. The sky was shrouded in pink light. The leaves on the trees have taken on a golden color. Andreas addresses Vivian by name. Andreas asks her to go with the students without harming them, for time is short and he must stop Karen. Vivian stands at a loss and stares off into the distance. Vivian immediately agrees to Andreas's request and tells him that she will catch up with him soon. Andreas thinks about the fact that he would be glad if Vivian stayed here. Andreas rushes on, telling Vivian that he is leaving these students to her. She stands, drawing her sharp sword, staying behind the fleeing Andreas. Someone's hand directs a magical flash at Andreas. He doesn't notice it. Vivian sees that it is directed at him and quickly decides what to do. She stares intently at the flash of light flying straight at Andreas. With her long sword, she blocks the blow, taking it in her stride. The flash hits her sharp sword. Holding her sword right in front of her face, Vivian looks focused and very serious. Andreas runs and turns around to look at her. At this point, he thinks about the fact that he managed to split up with Vivian. He really hopes she doesn't kill the students. Vivian fights the flashes flying towards her by jumping high up. While Andreas quickly runs towards Karen, he thinks about just letting go of the situation and believing in Vivian. The sun is setting behind the mountains, illuminating everything around with bright rays. The sky is colored bright red. It is deep autumn. Karen stands and stares at the fearsome monster with 4 paws and a horrible face standing across from him. The monster's jaws are wide open and its fingers have sharp claws. Heron stares at the monster, enjoying the sight. He is pleased that he is now in complete control of it. Suddenly he sees something in front of him that shocks him. His eyebrows furrow and his eyes widen involuntarily. He abruptly forms a wall of bones in front of him in an attempt to defend himself. Many animal and human bones form a wall of defense. He turns back around and grits his teeth. His gaze is filled with rage and hatred. He looks in horror at Andreas standing behind him. The monster stands obediently beside him. Andreas becomes convinced that Professor Heron really did it. Andreas takes a decisive step towards Karen. Not a single emotion is visible on his face. He is completely cold-blooded. Heron asks him why he is here. Andreas frowns his eyebrows and tells Professor Heron about how he thought he'd make it in time, but he's too late. An ugly monster stands behind Andreas. It has a terrifying mouth, and ghastly eyes can be seen in its forehead and on the sides of its head. Andreas senses the abnormally fast seal breaking time and the strange magic around this monster. Andreas looks at Karen's hand holding the red peladrin crystal above him, which is involved here. Jester had it in the game, which means he's behind all of this. Karen smiles coldly and asks Andreas how he dared to attack him. He remarks that it doesn't matter now because he was just about to look for him. Andreas smiles slyly with his head down and replies to Heron that it's all surprising because he didn't think he'd get to Dina. Karen stands and looks at him. Andreas adds that he is surprised that some worm was able to trick Dina. Heron pressed his lips together. He feels very hurt by the words Andreas has said to him. He wrinkles his forehead. Karen continues to hold the hovering peladrin crystal in his hand and chuckles evilly. Andreas looks at him with a nonchalant gaze and doesn't understand what is making him so funny. Karen rocks his mouth and wrinkles his forehead. He angrily tells Andreas that he is too arrogant and that he knew he took him in for a reason. He confesses to Andreas that long ago he secretly overheard a conversation between his father and Morn. Andreas's father Cain approaches Morn and says that if they can grow it, it will change the basis of dark magic or even the whole world. Morn agrees and says it's a very scary thing. At this time, Heron is unnoticed by them, standing behind the wall and eavesdropping on their conversation. Karen is greatly surprised by this. He concludes from Andreas's changed behavior that he has that object or knows how to use it. The dreaded tree stands in flames. Andreas is amazed that even such an unimportant character knows about it. Karen stands, mouth wide open, and orders Andreas to show him the legacy his father, Cain Cromwell, left him. An ugly monster stands behind him, mouth open. Andreas smiles wryly and remarks that this is very silly. He says that he kept wondering what Heron was going to say, and it turned out that he was planning to rob the kid. Heron stares at him angrily with his eyebrows furrowed. His pupils constrict with anger. Andreas holds a hovering circle in his palm. Nickel appears behind him. An enraged tiger, Timur, appears right in front of him. Andreas angrily tells Heron to stop talking. Karen looks at Andreas in amazement and wonders if that tiger is Lord Timur. He guesses that he got it from the meeting. Andreas stands focused, with his faithful assistants, Nickel and Timur, standing beside him on both sides. Karen is amazed that Andreas can already control high-level undead, but he immediately realizes that as long as he has the Perdarin crystal, he is omnipotent. He turns to Andreas, advising him not to forget who his mentor was. Andreas smiles evilly and tells him that he never taught him anything and that, yet the student was still able to surpass the teacher. Karen chuckles loudly, raising his hand in the air. The raised hand reveals a hovering magic stone. From the dwelling, Heron calls Andreas an insolent brat. With the help of a magic circle, Heron summons a multitude of reanimated skeletons. The main monster, Kushane, stands obediently behind him. The ugly skeletons stare with their empty eye sockets at Andreas, waiting for a command from their master. Many skeleton soldiers were also summoned by Karen to finish off Andreas. A headless knight stands holding a weapon. The moons burn brightly in the dark sky. A fearsome monster with crooked teeth and several eyes also stands waiting for a command from Karen. Andreas looks closely at his opponents and knows that Kushine enhances all of Karen's summoned creatures. Andreas takes up the golden hilt of his sword to finally take down the villainous Karen and his army. Andreas looks at Karen with eyes full of hatred and angrily tells him that he's had enough of him and that here and now he's burning the bridge between them. Karen smiles evilly, showing all his teeth. He laughs and says that he is very interested to see what will come of this because he is going to kill Andreas and take his father's inheritance from him, Cain Cromwell. He goes on to tell Andreas that after this, his corpse will become his slave. Andreas gets even angrier at the words he hears. Vivian is fighting with the students at this time. In a leap, she hits one of the guys. Vivian looks at the student flying to the ground and thinks that she must catch up with Andreas to help him. But there's one thing. She looks intently at the students she just fought with and defeated them. She exhales. But then she sees them continue to get up off the ground. It didn't turn out to be that simple. One of the students has a thin trickle of blood running down his face. What has just happened to him makes him even angrier. The face of one of the students is bloody. She looks mad, her mouth wide open. Vivian clutches her sword tightly in her hand and thinks about how she can disarm them. At that moment, the thought of just killing them and ending them once and for all pops into her head. But she remembers Andreas's request. He turns to her with a serious look and asks her to try not to hurt them. She realizes that her plan is impossible as Mr. Fee won't like it. The students surround her, getting to their feet. One of them stands behind her back holding a glowing ball of light in his hand. Bright streaks from the glowing orb head straight for her back. Vivian doesn't immediately realize what's happening. These many stripes have no effect on her. She deftly swings her sword away from them. While she is spreading her light influence, from behind, one of the students comes at her from the back. He looks furious, his mouth showing sharp fangs, his eyes burning red. Vivian recalls the moment she stands behind Andreas's back and hears him say some secret word. After what he said, he punches Dina to bring her to her senses. Vivian guesses that at that moment he said some spell. As the enraged student attacks, her head lights up this moment. She remembers what word Andreas said then, before hitting Dina. She utters that very secret word. She shouts the word Kushane loudly. At that moment, the student heading towards her falls to the ground with a clatter. Vivian looks at him contentedly. The spell has worked. She looks pleased and walks closer to the student who has just fallen to the ground and holds out her hand. The student fell to the ground with such force that his head smashed through it. He grunts in pain and lies face down. Vivian wonders if she has done something wrong. She tries again to remember what Andreas said at that moment. She turns back and sees that one of the students with pigtails on her head is now holding a glowing ball of light that is about to fly at her. The girl with the glowing orb comes close to Vivian, and without wasting a second, she kicks her in the face with her foot. At that moment, she utters the word Kushwin, but that word doesn't work either. One of the students is trying to shout something loudly. His mouth is wide open. The other student just stands there, staring mesmerized at Vivian. Blood spurts from his mouth. Vivian shouts out the word Pushane, and it turns out to be wrong again. It's pitch black in the forest. Vivian tries all kinds of similar options, but nothing works. The light from the bright moons in the sky dimly illuminates the forest. All around you can see trees colored in gold. Vivian jumps from place to place trying to defend herself from the distraught students. She feels that her affairs are bad, and that at this rate they will die soon. She tries another option by mouthing the word Kushine. At the same instant, the faces of the students change. They open their eyes wide when they hear this word. The exhausted students freeze at that moment. Vivian looks at them perplexed and doesn't understand why they froze. A black haze begins to appear around the students. She wonders if this is the right word, and it worked. She stands in front of them and makes a decision. Vivian strikes an attacking pose and, smiling, decides that now they just need to be beaten. Horrible worm-like monsters appear behind the students. They try to inhabit them. The students have no pupils in their eyes. Vivian abruptly jumps out of her seat and decides that she needs to end them immediately before they make a terrible mess of things. She is furiously heading straight for them. Her fist is clenched tightly at the same time. Scary monsters are coming to attack her. They have glowing, crazy eyes and wide-open mouths. The monsters turn into narrow bands trying to attack Vivian and possess her. A strange bardic mass starts clinging to her head and tries to enslave her. Vivian watches this with horror. Vivian lands a crushing blow to that mass, and she's tapped out. The huge creature with glowing eyes looks at Vivian slyly and asks her why she is hiding. Vivian freezes at the words spoken. The monster tries to provoke her by saying that she will be left alone anyway. Vivian stands frozen at the words. The monster peers at her with his glowing eye and tells Vivian that this is her fate. The monster keeps pressing on the most painful part and says it's terrible that she's clawing at life with her teeth. Tears come to Vivian's eyes. Vivian remembers how small and defenseless she was. She is handcuffed and looks at her hands in horror. The monster goes on to say that she believed the stranger, even though her mother didn't even want her. Little Vivian has shackles with chains on her arms and legs. She tries to cover her ears so that she won't hear her father's lies about wanting a son and her mother's words about how it would have been better if she hadn't given birth to her. Tears of resentment rolled down in Vivian's eyes. The monster keeps saying that her life is a mistake and that everyone around her will die because of her. Vivian opens her mouth wide, tears traitorously starting to flow down her cheeks. The monster looks at her angrily and asks her why she shouldn't die quietly alone. He's blatantly provoking her. At this moment, Vivian's only thought is that if she disappears, will Mr. Faya be safe? She stands with her sword on her shoulder. The mad students are approaching, holding out their hands towards her. Vivian recalls Andreas's promise. Her eyes are sad. She is in utter confusion. She recalls the moment when Mr. Fairy extends his little finger to her, and she, in turn, extends hers to him. They hold each other tightly. She recalls the moment when Mr. Fairy asked her to keep her promise to him. Vivian and Mr. Fairy stand holding on with their little fingers, everything around them collapsing into millions of shards. And they continue to stand, not noticing anything around them. She remembers his words, that he would always look out for her. Vivian opens her eyes wide and looks somewhere in the distance. Her lips are compressed and a stingy tear runs down her cheek. Meanwhile, Andreas is engaged in a bloodthirsty battle. Bones and skulls are flying in different directions. Tiger Timur, who has come to Andreas's aid, breaks the dead to pieces with a single blow. Nickel is also not left out and skillfully wields his sword. He strikes with such precision that the dead are blown to pieces. Andreas deftly swings his sword, covering his face with his hand. He glances sideways at Nickel and Timur. Heron, mouth wide, mimicking a smile, stares intently at his glowing crystal, holding it above his palm. He is curious to see how far they will go. Heron looks mad. Behind him is a huge monster with a bright flash of light coming out of its mouth. Andreas looks at him fearfully. His face is creased. He makes a lightning-fast decision. He summons the giant Rudolph to his aid. A glowing magic ball forms in his hand. Andreas stares at it intently. A huge hand appears from a magical passage in the sky and hits the monster's head with all its might. The monster falls to his knees in surprise. Heron stares at what is happening in amazement, not taking his eyes off. He stares in horror at what is happening behind his back and doesn't realize what this huge monster called Andreas. The giant's huge fist is sticking out of the sky. Heron's monster stares pitifully somewhere, tears appearing in his eyes from the pain. Andreas and Timur angrily run somewhere. Timur looks as focused and dangerous as possible. A terrifying fat monster appears before Andreas. Its mouth is wide open, revealing many small, sharp teeth. Andreas shouts to Timur that he is leaving the big guy to him. Timur stares angrily at the fat man and grinds his teeth. His eyes are filled with blood and hatred. Andreas rushes over to Nickel and gets behind him. At that moment, he tells him to get rid of those assholes and hide immediately. Without further ado, Timur rushes to attack the fat monster. He looks fierce and very angry. Andreas exhales and ponders the fact that it's not wise to spend so much mana on a costly Rudos. He looks focused and makes an important decision. He decides to approach Charon and steal the coveted crystal from him himself. Timur and the fat monster hold hands, preventing each other from attacking. Andreas flies over them. Heron looks at his monster and rejoices that he should not have died from such a blow. The monster howled furiously, mouth wide open. Charon looks indignantly at how powerful and fast Andreas and the tiger Timur are attacking. Andreas looks focused. His gaze is filled with confidence and determination. A bright flash of light flies at Charon. The monster's powerful paw takes the blow. Andreas looks on as the horrible monster stands up to Heron's defense, blocking him. The monster's fearsome face is grinning, its eyes burning brightly. Andreas looks at Charon carefully and reasons that mortal sins can help him a lot, but greed has a big payoff, and laziness is still reloading. Charon smiles gloatingly and laughs in his face. He asks Andreas about what he thinks he can pull off against an ancient magical beast. Andreas adopts a determined attack pose. He tells Heron that he seems to like the old toys, but he has a magical beast too. Andreas is reminded of that huge hand that descended from the heavens and struck the monster Karen with incredible force. Karen fearfully wonders if it was really a giant and where he could find it. Andreas smiles slyly and tells Heron that next time he will crack his head open. He decides he needs to intimidate him as much as possible. But Karen doesn't give up. His eyebrows are furrowed and he looks at Andreas carefully, telling him to give it a try if he can. Andreas sees that these words do not frighten Karen but only turn him on more. Watching his face, he realizes this with horror and opens his eyes wide. Andreas forms a magical image with mysterious symbols on the ground around him. They are colored red, like blood. A bright column of bloody color soars above the trees and rushes into the sky. It splashes in all directions. Sharon is gloating with laughter. He is enjoying it immensely. Red droplets are scattered near him. Andreas also soars high up and floats above the ground. Bloody rings swirl around him. He is perplexed as to how he was able to do this. Andreas descends to the ground and gets into an attack pose. Karen stands, holding a glowing crystal, while his loyal monster continues to stand behind him and guard. Andreas looks at his palms incomprehensibly and assumes that vampire blood magic has just happened to him. He juxtaposes events and recalls the bite in Angela Lucifer's neck by a vampire girl. He suggests that it is likely that Karen has been studying Angela's blood. Heron asks Andreas about how he survived the high-ranking blood magic. Andreas looks at him silently. Andreas smiles slightly and tells him that it's probably thanks to Angela's gift to Lucifer. Heron instantly changes in his face. His forehead shows wrinkles, his eyebrows are furrowed, his teeth are clenched. He tells Andreas not to say that she ran away because of him. Andreas smiles wryly and apologizes. He tells Heron that he could have treated his apprentice better, meaning himself. Heron can't contain his emotions anymore. He screams Andreas's name loudly. The veins on his forehead swell, his eyes become crazed, and his mouth opens wide. Andreas looks at him coldly and realizes that he has hit the most painful one. Andreas jumps up high with his sword in hand. He tries to attack Karen, but he moves from his seat with lightning speed. Sharon looks at him angrily and asks loudly about how dare he ruin a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Heron's scary monster starts attacking Andreas, trying to grab him with its huge paws. Andreas manages to dodge. Andreas turns his attention to Timur fighting behind his back. He realizes that Nickel is already out of sight. He lifts his head up and glares angrily, swinging his sword. Andreas decides that now is the best time to attack Karen and take the magic crystal from him. He tries to get close to him. Andreas jumps up on one leg, arms spread wide. At that moment, he swings his sword skillfully. But the fearsome monster outpaces him and thrusts a huge paw forward just enough to grab Andreas. Heron's face takes on a frightened expression. He's pissed off that this gorilla, meaning Andreas, is stronger than he thought. Andreas approaches Heron from behind as close as possible. He points his sharp sword with its golden hilt at him. But at that moment, the monster's huge paw squeezes him. Andreas, without expecting it, opens his eyes wide. A scarlet trickle of blood spurts from Andreas's mouth. He is lost in space for a moment. The huge monster, without much effort, grabs him and throws him a great distance away. Karen watches the scene carefully. At that moment, someone from behind cuts off Heron's hand holding the glowing magic crystal. Heron doesn't immediately realize what just happened. He gets his arm chopped off by Nickel with his sword. Karen looks at him indignantly, not understanding where he came from. At this moment, it reaches Heron what just happened. He opens his eyes wide with amazement and frowns his eyebrows. Lying on the ground, Andreas lifts his head slightly and chuckles gloatingly. Blood spreads across his face. It is night. Only the light from the moon illuminates the bright leaves on the trees. Sharon is screaming furiously. Drool spurts from his mouth. He is filled with hatred and anger. Andreas looks on admiringly at what is happening and tells Nickel that he did well. A slight smile can be seen on his face. Blood continues to flow from his forehead. Sharon clutches at his shoulder confusedly, his arm missing at the elbow. He grunts and winces in pain. The monster continues to stand behind him. Only now does Karen realize that his severed hand contained a magic crystal. His eyes go wide with fright. The monster is becoming beastly in front of his eyes. Its four paws are clenched with rage, its muzzle wide open upward. It howls loudly. A bright light burns from his mouth. Karenin turns around and looks at him in surprise. Andreas is also looking at the huge monster with horror. His mouth is open in amazement, his eyes full of fear. He realizes that Kushain is out of control. Charon instantly approaches the crystal and reaches for it with his hand. The horrible monster is heading after him. Charon stares at the ground in horror. His brow furrowed, his face a look of unconcealed fear. There is a bright flash of light that illuminates everything around and blinds those standing nearby. Andreas stands like a stumbling block and cannot help but utter a word. He watches in horror at what is happening without taking his eyes off. The monster leans towards Heron and bites into him. Heron's face expresses utter devastation. The monster's mouth is full of blood. His eyes are embittered. Heron's body falls to the ground with a thunderous crash. Blood flows from his eyes and mouth. The monster's muzzle is tilted as close to the ground as possible. Andreas bounces away from them, taking advantage of the moment. The monster is bent over Heron's immobile body. His blood is flowing from his mouth. Andreas seizes the moment and tells Nickel to distract the monster Kushain, as they just need to get their hands on that crystal. Nickel looks at Kushain carefully and thinks of a plan to carry out and distract him to take away the crystal. At that second, Kushain takes the crystal in his powerful paw and squeezes it with such force that hundreds of shards fly in different directions. Andreas stares at the scene in confusion. He is simply terrified. He and Nickel continue to hold their sharp swords in their hands. Kushain, in turn, opens the paw in which he had just clutched the crystal, and the remnants of it spill out. Tiger Timur roars angrily, raising his paws up. The scary monsters standing nearby open their mouths in horror. Andreas watches in horror as a bright flash of light shines out of Kushain's huge mouth, and he realizes that their business is bad. Kushain growls loudly, opening his maw. A bright flash erupts from his mouth. Andreas is horrified to see what Kushain is doing and shouts loudly to his assistants to duck immediately. The released flash of light flies and explodes, falling to the ground. The explosion happens with such force that it illuminates everything around it. Andreas manages to distance himself from the flash and tries to defend himself against it by putting his sword in front of his face. At that second, the monster Kushain's huge paw grabs him and lifts him up. Andreas confusedly tries to get out of it, but he fails. Kushain lifts Andreas high up and opens his jaws wide. Tiger Timur lifts his head up and looks in horror at what is happening to his master. His mouth is grinning and his eyes are bloodshot. Nickel is also watching Andreas closely, his teeth clenched, his eyes filled with hatred. Tiger Timur, without hesitation, rushes to Andreas's aid. At this time, Kushain continues to hold Andreas in his hand and tries to run away. Andreas frustratedly screams with desperation. His mouth is wide open, his gaze directed upwards. He continues to hold his sword in his hand. At that moment, suddenly Vivian bursts in. She approaches Kushain with lightning speed. Andreas indignantly calls out to Vivian. His face crinkles, his hair flying around in the wind. Vivian sharply cuts off Kushain's paw, and Andreas falls from a great height right onto his back. Vivian runs up to him at that moment and screams his name. Andreas flies straight to the ground with incredible speed while still holding his sword in his hand. Vivian quickly approaches him and holds out her hand to keep him from falling. Andreas, meanwhile, flies downward without letting go of his sword. At that moment, Kushain approaches Vivian from behind. He pulls her back to him with his mouth open. Andreas, watching all this happening, loudly and angrily yells at Vivian to watch her back. A flash from the sword flies right in front of Kushain's face. He watches it with bewilderment. Bright flashes burn everywhere. Andreas exhaustedly tries to find Vivian and make sure she's all right. At a loss, Andreas desperately shouts her name. He realizes with horror that she has disappeared somewhere, and it was he who called her with him to help. Andreas turns around and sees that the Tiger Timur has her clasped tightly to him, thus protecting her from what is happening. Vivian is unconsciously in his strong paws. She is like a baby lying motionless. Andreas exhales with relief and realizes that Vivian is perfectly safe and protected. Andreas turns his head in the opposite direction and sees the monster Kushain in front of him. At this time, the Tiger Timur continues to sit by the rock and cradles Vivian with all his might, protecting her. Andreas changes in his face. He becomes focused and cruel, realizing that he has no time to worry. He forms a magical hole behind him, from which a bony hand appears, holding a magic crown. Andreas is thinking that he would like to gather more information first, but there is one thing. Andreas puts the magic crown on his head. He looks serious and determined. It is written on the electronic board that the primary sin of greed has been detected. He is invited to apply this function. Andreas realizes that it is better to let things happen this way than to have to die. He decisively decides to use the proposed function. Vivian opens her eyes confusedly and stares questioningly at what is happening, not immediately realizing where she is. In the moment, she fully comes to her senses and opens her eyes wide with horror. Andreas approaches the monster Kushane. A magical light with many light beams from Andreas is directed straight into its open maw. Vivian's eyes fill with tears. She looks at the scene confusedly and says the word fairy quietly. Andreas's grimace takes on a terrifying look. His eyes glow bright red, his mouth expressing an embittered grin. The crown is held firmly on his head. Circles of light surround Kushane. A loud roar is emitted from his mouth. Andreas continues to stand and stare at him. Andreas jumps high up, holding his sword in his hand. He turns to Kushane with a sly smile on his face and calls him a foul, ancient beast. He heads determinedly towards the monster, emitting bright beams of light. Andreas shouts at him that he will turn him undead and make him his slave. The expression on Andreas's face depicts utter pleasure at what is happening. He smiles widely and giggles loudly and gloatingly. Andreas soars high above Kushane and smashes him in the face with his sword with great force. But this strike will not succeed. Andreas ducks his sword from a bright flash of light. Andreas flies a short distance away and uses his legs to try to hold on. A lot of rocks fall on him. Andreas realizes that Kushane has impeccable defense and that he only responds to deliberate strikes. At this moment, he thinks of Vivian and how she cleverly chopped off his paw, as he was in no way expecting it. He, with a sly grin on his face, decides that a surprise attack is needed that will work just right. Andreas turns to Nickel and tells him to be a decoy for Kushane. Nickel agrees unconditionally. Andreas and Kushane are facing each other and waiting to attack. They look focused. Vivian sits quietly in the safety of Timur the tiger's arms and watches the scene with a sinking heart. Nickel walks determinedly towards Kushane, trying to turn his attention back to himself. Vivian looks on in surprise at what is happening. She is surprised to see the undead in front of her, looking at Nickel